IronOverload.io Hardcore, episode 70 coming your way. This is a revisited 2024 update of Testosterone Enanthate, Testosterone Cypionate, Testosterone Propionate. So we're going to talk about these three. If you don't know much about any of these different testosterone esters, this is the podcast for you because we're going to go over each. And we're going to show you exactly how to use them to your advantage. It's going to be a really, really, really cool podcast.
Yes.
And very, very important to really know. So look, testosterone is the building block of all steroids, naturally produced hormone in the body. It's secreted by our testes. It's responsible for the balanced growth, maintenance of primary and secondary sexual characteristics in males, and it responsible for the deepening of the voice, broadness of shoulders, narrowing of pelvis, rapid hair growth, production of semen for sexual production, etc., etc. Men have more testosterone than women. Women also need testosterone, just like men need estrogen, and women have estrogen, and men need estrogen as well, just to function. So these are hormones. Now, testosterone is considered the quote-unquote male hormone, and estrogen is considered the quote-unquote female hormone. But that's step one. We have to realize that both genders have it. Now, females, they produce testosterone differently. They produce it through their ovaries. Now, we see a lot of people now, males, doing testosterone replacement therapy. It's become an epidemic, especially in America. You have anti-aging clinics on every corner now, and they basically are putting people on TRT. Even people who don't even need to go on TRT, they're putting them on TRT. And without actually trying to solve the root issue of why this person has low testosterone, they'll just put you on TRT because they want the cash, you see. They want to make a sale. So we're seeing a lot of people, a lot of you might be listening to this podcast. Maybe you are looking into doing TRT, or maybe you got put on TRT and you're using testosterone enanthate or testosterone cypionate. So you're going to learn a lot as well from this podcast. Now we're seeing females being put also on TRT who have low testosterone levels as they get older. And that can, so at the end of the day, like, there are benefits of going on testosterone. But in a lot of cases, the way I look at it and the way Mobster looks at it is, look, at the end of the day, a lot of you out there, you don't need the TRT yet. You think it's going to make a difference. You think it's going to, make your life better. And what happens a lot of times, I used to play poker with a lot of older dudes, a lot of rich older dudes. And of course, they were all on TRT, but they were just as miserable. They were just as fat. They were just as out of shape. Just as, in bad health as they were before the testosterone. The only difference was they got on the testosterone, they're a little more hornier. That's the only difference. So really, if you think going on testosterone is going to magically like cure your life's ills, I'm telling you, it doesn't make any sense. So it's important to make sure you realize that. A lot of people who might be listening to this, because you're like, oh, I want to go on testosterone to make benefits, but not necessarily going to give you the benefits you wanted, unless specifically the low testosterone is what's ailing you, and only that. But a lot of cases, it's not. A lot of cases, it's poor diet, poor nutrition, poor sleep. Like, let's say you get 3 hours of sleep every night for the last 5 years. You've gotten only 3 hours of sleep a night. What do you think is going to happen to your testosterone levels? Of course, they're going to drop. So it makes more sense, instead of just going on TRT and continuously getting 3 hours of sleep, get 7 to 8 hours as humans are supposed to get. And this way your testosterone levels will rebound. And then that will get you where you want to go. So touch on that, Mobster, a little bit, because a lot of people.
I mean, we could do a whole show on this, Steve. I mean, but I tried to keep this side of it brief. And the phrase that springs to mind is "fix your shit." And I put it in those crude terms because I think it's accurate here, Steve. What we will occasionally see is someone who does have low testosterone levels go on TRT and they feel fucking amazing. And if I had a clinic, Steve, they would be my number one salesperson, because they're literally going to go out and say, oh, God, Steve, Mobster, I went on TRT. It was fucking amazing. I feel brilliant. I feel younger. I feel more vital. I'm horny, like Steve says. Christ, I can see abs. And that person's going to sell my product for me. But the truth of the situation is exactly like Steve just said. If you are not getting enough sleep, if your diet is shit, and let's be frank, most people's diets are shit, if you're not getting enough sleep, and most people don't, Steve, they'll have caffeinated drinks late in the day, then they'll stay up late watching Netflix. They don't get 6-7 hours sleep. They get woke up in the morning because they chose to have kids early. The kids get up early because that's what kids do. They go rushing to work without having food, or they take a cup of coffee with them, all that kind of stuff, right? They're stressing over bills. They buy shit they don't need. They're going for a divorce. The boss at work's giving them shit, blah, 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 blah. And then they wonder why their test levels are horrendous. You could literally sit them down and say, well, go to bed 8 o'clock. Go to bed. Oh, I don't want to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Motherfucker, you need to go to bed at 8 o'clock. And then you're going to get up at 6 o'clock. And you're going to have 10 hours fucking sleep. Right? You're going to have your blackout blinds in your bedroom. You're going to clear all that crap out of your fridge and your freezer and your cupboards, and you're going to get organic stuff. It's a bit more expensive, but you're going to thank me in the long run. That job that you're doing, you hate it, get a different job. Learn a new skill. Earn the same amount of money, but be happier. Lo and behold, test them on their test level, Steve. Better. Simple as that. That said, for some people, when it comes to TRT, those, like I said, the number one salesperson is going to go out and bang that drum. If there's a chemical reason, if you've got a biological reason, if you've got some genetic predisposition, maybe you don't have choices like the ones I've just discussed. Maybe you are a hardworking motherfucker that needs to do 12 hours a day for whatever reason. Maybe you are in a situation where the pollution's crazy, the water quality is shit, and so on and so forth, and you can't afford to move. That person is going to be it's going to be wonderful, Steve. They're going to feel fucking amazing. I mean, the other thing is, and I say this when it comes to TRT and for that matter, performance enhancement, is to hold off for as long as you possibly can, and you'll see greater benefits from waiting than you will if you hopped on TRT or PEDs quicker, sooner than you needed to. That's just a sort of story for life, Steve, and it's right out. In terms of, and I'll say this as well, Steve, just to get the rest of the show rolling, there's an analogy which I think applies here when it comes, and we're going to talk about specifically the esters and their application and how we can manipulate that, for example, in different stacks, different cycles, different approaches, frequency of injection, and so on. But there's a great analogy which I think applies here, and that is test is test. I will also say that all, possibly maybe by one or two, so 98% of steroids are testosterone based, but it's the ester, it's the manipulation of that particular steroid to create a different effect for medical reasons, for performance enhancement reasons, that creates a different outcome. But here really, in terms of your muscle gains, in terms of your strength, and especially if they were run solo, which in the case of a couple of these esters can be run solo, it's again a combination in a stack that's going to also affect the outcome. But for the most part, test is test. What do I mean by that? In simple terms, if I use a form of testosterone, I would expect the outcome ultimately to be the same. If I'm using it for strength, I expect to get stronger. If I'm using it to get lean, I expect to get leaner. The reality of the situation is, again, if they were run solo, it's how long that effect takes to take place. So, for example, Cypionate would be the longer one. Enanthate would be somewhere in the middle. It actually stretches out towards Cypionate. Other forms would be quicker acting. So it's quicker in the system, quicker to do the job, versus longer in the system, longer to do the job. I mean, that's an oversimplification, Steve, but I think ultimately that's it. But yeah, in terms of the TRT stuff, I agree 100%. It is not miracle cure. And what we are seeing specifically through the forums, and Steve and I do talk about this, we do bang this particular drum. Some of you, and I'm going to include some of the listeners, but especially on the forums, are on TRT really as just a way of staying on longer than they should have done, i.e. blasting and cruising. And ultimately, a few of you are on TRT way sooner than you needed to be because you're going to fix the other issues that we've described. You can fix what you do.
If you go to an anti-aging clinic and you're sleeping 3 hours a night, the anti-aging clinic is
not going to rub their hands, man.
They're not going to tell you sleep more and your testosterone levels will rebound. They're going to want to put you on TRT. Yeah. But the problem
it's like the old joke about some of the stuff we see, Stephen. We say osteopaths don't drive around in BMWs or drive around in Mercedes when they see some of the fucked up shit you're doing. The TRT clinics are the same. The anti-aging clinics are the same. If you fix your shit, they lose a customer. If you don't fix your shit, they gain a customer. And what are we looking at here, Steve? $300 fucking a month minimum versus what you can do for yourself. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. So keep that in mind. But let's talk about the performance enhancement and the way that we use the esters as part of that, Steve.
So the reason we're talking about these three esters, first of all, CYP, E, and Prop, Okay, because these are the three most popular used in that order. SIP and E are the top two, really tied for number one, and then you have the propionate, which is down the list. Now, why would someone use propionate? You got to inject them more often. A lot of times it's for flexibility. A lot of times it's competitors going into a show. Let me explain the way esters and half-lives work really quick, and so you understand where I'm coming from. If you're going into a show, you don't want to have that water retention. So if you're on SIP or E, it's going to be in your system longer after you stop it. But if you're using propionate, it's a much shorter half-life. So it's going to be out of your system much quicker. So the water retention is going to be gone. You don't want to go on stage with water retention. The judges will obviously penalize you for that. So that's the worst thing that you can do. So that's why you see propionate. And a lot of people also, they'll use propionate because they want it in their system quicker for whatever reason. Maybe they're doing a short cycle. If you're doing a cycle of 8 weeks or less, you'd want propionate to use propionate because it'd be in your system quicker and your system quicker. So you can start recovering quicker. So that'd be an advantage. Now, the disadvantage is you're going to have to inject them more often. And with propionate, it tends to hurt more. The post-injection pain seems to be more of an issue. I know with me, it was definitely an issue. Cypionate and enanthate, you don't have to inject it as often. It's more smooth of an injection. And it's really, really easy to use. You literally just have to pin it once a week, twice a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever. Now, in terms of the half-life numbers, depends where you look. Again, we're revisiting these 2024 from the information that I've gathered from very reliable sources, okay? Not bro scientists, from actually reliable sources. I'm going to say Cypionate, you're talking 12 days. Enanthate, you're talking 10.5 days. And propionate, you're talking 3.5 days. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean what you think. A lot of times people don't understand what these half-lives means. Half-life means half of what you injected is in your system. So if something has a 10-day half-life, I'll make it simple for you. If it has a 10-day half-life, then you injected 500 milligrams. Then 10 days from today, you'll have 250 milligrams left. And then 10 days after that, you'll have 125 milligrams left, and so on. It could cut in half every 10 days. It doesn't mean after the 10 days, the 500 milligrams that you originally injected is completely out of your system. Also, as you continue to inject on a regular schedule, more and more gets built up in your system. Because you remember, as some is leaving your system, you're injecting more into your system. So it's building up until it gets to the point where there's as much going in as leaving because you're deep enough into your cycle. So let's say something like enanthate, for example, it's 10.5 day half-life, but let's make an example that's a 10-day half-life to make this simple. So after you start injecting enanthate, all right, if you inject it once every 10 days, for example, after 50 days, you will have injected day 1, day 10, day 20, day 30, day 40, and day 50. That's 6 injections, right? During that 6 injections, every 10 days, half of what you injected the 10 days prior and the 20 days prior and the 30 days prior and the 40 days prior, on and on will also trickle out of your system. So it will take about that long. You multiply it by 5, I'd say 4 to 5. So 40 to 50 days. And that will be how long it's peaking in your system and leveling off. After you stop taking it, the opposite happens. It gradually comes out of your system as every 10 days, it'll go out of your system, more and more, really every day. But you see what I'm saying? Like half of it every day. So it's going to trickle out of your system slowly. So it's not something where you stop injecting and the next day, boom, it's out of your system. It's going to take longer. It's going to take 40 to 50 days to be out of your system. But if you take propionate, it's only got a 3.5 day half-life. So it's going to be out of your system quicker. In about 15 to 20 days, it'll be out of your system. So if you've got a competition coming up in 2 to 3 weeks, what a lot of competitors will do, they'll stop taking the testosterone propionate 2 or 3 weeks ahead of their competition. This way, on competition day, they've got things like Masteron and Winstrol and Proviron and Tren and those in their system. that are not going to have them hold water because they don't want to hold water. So that's the purpose of using these half-lives. Now, when it comes to long-term TRT, obviously the logical choice is to go with the longer esters. Go with the Cypionate, which is the longest ester, or enanthate, which is also a long ester, but maybe a day or two less in a half-life. This way you can inject, because if you're going to inject something the rest of your life, wouldn't you want to inject something the rest of your life once every week, once every 10 days, once every 2 weeks, versus having to inject it every 2 or 3 days like you would with propionate? You see what I'm saying? So that would be the reason for people who are on TRT using either CYP or E. Go ahead, Mobster.
Yeah, on the Cypionate one, Steve, and funny enough, I've seen this. It's actually kind of a comment that sometimes users on the forums will make, and I agree with. We have seen clinics where they get the 1 injection a month of Cypionate. And the longest I've ever seen, yes, the half-life quoted, that was 21 days. But I'm actually going to agree that it's less. And again, it depends on the condition of the person in question, or for our purposes, an athlete. So if you're fat, it's going to be a different time from someone who's lean and in condition. That just makes sense right there. The other thing, again, is that ultimately, sometimes proper TRT, clinically given as it used to be, Steve, is not necessarily for an enhancement of how that person feels walking around in relationships and whatever else, but more to do with blood markers and other reasons for what that we could talk about in terms of health. So originally, the TRT was a longer thing, typically, as I said, sometimes once a month, although that seems to have changed because they realized that a person could feel great after the period, and then 20 days in, that effect starts to wear off, and that sense of well-being that some users get when they're on TRT started to drop away. And by the end of the month, it's the same as women with HRT, Steve. You go, oh, great, it takes me a couple of days to feel awesome. Then I feel great for 2 weeks, feel horny, I'm grabbing hold of my husband, and so on and so forth. But by the end of the month, 28 days, I feel like shit again. I feel like I'm not on HRT, and I can't wait to go on HRT. Even, I mean, the girlfriend has a B12 injection roughly every 3 months, Steve. And by the end of the 3 months, feels horrible. Can't wait for the fucking B12 to kick back in again. And so what we find has happened now is a little bit more frequent. And for example, in those listeners and members of the forums that do their own form of TRT, and we make sure that it ideally suggested you still go and get blood tests, you still monitor your health markers, and you don't just use it as an excuse, as I said earlier on, to be blasted and cruising. It's typically, I would say, and I know this even for buddies that are local, a small injection once a week, sometimes twice or once a fortnight, and then typically to not, because of the build-up in the system that Steve described, we'd be 3 weeks on, 1 week off. But again, look at the comparable dosages, and we'll just touch on this as well for TRT purposes again. What we see typically for those that self-TRT, in the case of Cypionate, I very rarely see it much under 200 milligrams, Steve, 300 milligrams is also quite common. Whereas when you and I talk about clinics and the original dosages that were given, we were seeing 120 milligrams or the equivalent of 120 milligrams, sometimes less per week. Because again, what the clinics were doing before the whole life extension, etc. stuff, and they realized there's a big business to be made here, was looking after your health and your overall life versus the idea of giving you testosterone to make you feel better just for the sake of feeling better. The same as a shot of whiskey or a good cigar. But that's not the original intention. So it can be a little bit confusing. And you have to remember sometimes when people are having these kind of discussions about CYP and TRT and so on and so forth, ask them why they are doing what they're doing and the reason for the dosage. It's very rare for me to see, Steve, people doing self-TRT at the same dosages that you would see in clinics, even the kind that are taking $300 a month off you versus the original forms and the original dosage and the original frequency. So keep that in mind. What about in terms, I mean, I'll touch on the competition side as well for the performance enhancement side, Steve. And I've said this in terms of competition stacks and where testosterone has a role to play. You have to remember, listeners, that for us average Joes, and I say I'm including myself in this particular thing at the minute because what I'm doing for myself, not for competition, not for any particular sort of money in my pocket or whatever else. My sense of well-being comes from what I'm able to do in the gym. If you like, there's a small connection. I like going to the gym, full stop. But the way that these things work was that I don't need to be on a 16 or a 20-week cycle. However, if I was competing, especially at the top level, that's perfectly normal. I've seen 21, 22-week cycles, but they tend to take 3 stages. And so a competitor's cycle, and a lot of people like to ask about this. They like they marvel at the dosages that they see pros on. Steve referred to the numbers that we see in autopsies that have come up in the blood tests and so on and so forth, and other shows that we've done. It's not comparable to what most listeners and most users of testosterone, as per this podcast, are going to do. There tends to be 3 stages, which is the bulk stage, I get big and strong, which I should have been doing in off season anyway. They tend to be on something all year round, when perhaps they shouldn't be, and most listeners and users don't need to be. And then there's a sort of cutting down, getting lean stage, and finally, which is quite short, typically 6 weeks or so, that sort of competition look stage. And that's where the much shorter esters are used in all PEDs, because they want to be able to manipulate the look, they want to manipulate the condition. And I said on other shows, Steve, that it comes right down to it, a very fine art. When you really, really know what you're doing, you're working with an experienced athlete, and they have prep coaches, which sometimes includes the chemistry side. They are manipulating the athlete for the day, indeed afternoon or evening of a competition. And that would not apply, although it's fun to talk about, it won't apply for the typical listener, typical user of all kinds of testosterone, including the 3 esters that we're discussing today. Back to you.
So let's talk about dosing. And look, with testosterone, here's my thing. You're running a TRT dose, you're not going to need an AI if you run it 100, 125 milligrams. But if you start jacking up the dose 200, 300, 400, on and on, of course, because it does aromatize into estrogen. So that's one of the main side effects that you have to worry about when you're running testosterone is the estrogen issues. So it's very important to use an AI. If you're running moderate amounts of testosterone or higher amounts of testosterone, you really need to use an AI with it. Aromacin's the best choice. Arimidex is the second choice. And these will help disable the estrogen from aromatizing, causing these estrogenic side effects. I think it's very important to be smart and to do that. And a lot of people, they'll run testosterone. The good thing about testosterone in a cycle is that it's estrogenic, it's androgenic, it's anabolic. So you can just run it by itself and you can have good results on a cycle. You don't even need to stack it with anything. A lot of people like to use it as an androgen or an estrogen to add into a cycle to give the cycle a little bit of boost. So they'll use testosterone as a base in their cycle, anywhere from 100 milligrams to 500 milligrams and on. Some guys will run even higher, 1,000 milligrams on. And a lot of people like to use testosterone that way. But look, testosterone, CYP, and E, they're the #1 purchased steroids. We're talking 2024. You want to know the top 2? Those are tied for #1 of the most purchased because of their versatility. A lot of people feel really good on testosterone. They like the feeling they get on testosterone. A lot of people say it makes me feel young. It makes me feel like I'm a teenager again. So a lot of things, though, a lot of people you need to realize you're taking synthetic testosterone. It's not testosterone that's been extracted from another human being that's being put back into you. It's synthetic. It's made in a lab. So if you're going to argue with me and say that real testosterone being produced by the body is going to be less effective than synthetic testosterone, I'm just not going to agree with that. So if you want to basically recover your natural testosterone levels, you must realize when you use synthetic testosterone, exogenous testosterone, your body's going to realize it's got too much in the system and it will shut down. That's one of the biggest misconceptions, Mobster, we've seen over the years. This is things that guys pushed in the 90s and 2000s a lot. Like you must use testosterone on your cycle or you will get shut down. No, you're going to get shut down whether you use testosterone or not. All right? Your body is too smart. Your body knows when it's getting an excess.
Even Steve, even the analogy I've seen some of them use is that you should always have testosterone in a cycle, even without that. No, you don't. I've done a bunch of cycles when I've not used a specific testosterone cypionate enanthate. I've told, listeners, I said this before, but back in the day, me and my buddies would use the same source, some local person that we knew, that we knew that they were producing solid stuff, whatever else, whether it was local or we get it posted to us, whatever, right? We'd all have the same product, and they loved enanthate. I got zero from it. I always loved sustenance. Why do I like sustenance and multiple esters? I benefited from sustenance, and it did exactly what I wanted it to do for the purposes I was using for the top. But my buddies for strength loved enanthate, whereas I never seemed to get anything from it. So it was an affinity for me that wasn't there for enanthate. So yeah, and again, oh, when you should use it. No, I shouldn't. No, absolutely. We see this literally in people. Again, Steve says the phrase when he says they parrot information. They read it somewhere else and they parrot it. You should have testosterone. It should be the base of all cycles. No, absolutely not. It's bollocks. It works for some people, and for those people, absolutely. But does it work for everybody? No. So the same thing applies to the different versions and what you're going to use it for, and so on and so forth. For me, Steve, ultimately, it comes down to frequency of injection. I don't mind injecting myself, and as I get older, more practice, it becomes less uncomfortable. But I've never been a great fan of it, so I'm always going to choose something that I don't have to pin as often versus something that I have to do more often. It's just literally less times injecting per week, and I don't need that flexibility. And I like to have a lot of time off between cycles. That just makes sense. Again, listener, when you're picking over the bones of information, whether it's us talking to you now or whether you come onto the forums, you do need to understand sometimes that the person that's giving you advice meaningfully is trying to help you, but they're coming from a different place than what you are. You need to understand whether it's a choice of esters of testosterone or whatever performance enhancement drug that we're talking about, that needs to be for the same purposes and benefits that you want from your cycle. So, for example, in this particular case, Steve, as Steve said already, why is the number one and number two of injectables these two forms of testosterone? Well, one would obviously be the TRT side of things and less frequency of pinning, and the other would be literally that most people that use testosterone prefer the enanthate version because it works for them. So the majority of users, but not all. I'm going to say probably 60, 70, maybe even 80% would see some benefit, but that's still a big number on the table of the hundreds of thousands of users, millions of users just in America, Steve, that wouldn't see a benefit or wouldn't have a preference. So make sure the choice is correct for you, and that's the reason why we're giving you that information, Steve.
Let's talk some stacks that we like with testosterone before we finish up the show. So one of the best bulking stacks that I ever did, this is for appetite, this is for size, all right, was stacking testosterone and DECA. And the appetite on that stack was mind-boggling. And the way I did it is I did 500 milligrams of test and 400 milligrams of DECA together. Crazy appetite increases. I was eating like a horse on this stuff. And then I would recommend stacking in some Proviron as well anytime you run an Androlone. And also I recommend an AI with that, by the way. So make sure you're running all your proper ancillaries. Another really good stack if you want strength and mass is Tren and testosterone. And that would be a really good libido stack as well if you react well to androgens. And in general, if you react well to androgens, just be aware on that stack of the side effects. You want to make sure, because Tren does come with side effects. So there's a couple debates. Some people like to run the test higher than the Tren. Some people like to run them equal. Some people like to run the Tren higher than test. I can tell you right now, okay? If you want lower side effects, run the test low. Because you're running Tren for a reason, right? So run the test low with the Tren. This way you don't get estrogenic side effects. You're already going to get the androgenic side effects running them together. But why add the hassle of estrogenic side effects on top of it? It doesn't make sense. And it's just going to increase your androgenic side effects. Because think about it, why? If you're retaining a shit ton of water, your blood pressure is going to go up. You're going to have more trouble sleeping. You're going to have more endurance problems. All that shit, domino effects. So for me, it makes no sense to make it worse by adding more water retention to the problem. Doesn't make any sense. So keep your test low and Tren high. That's another bro science that we hear from people. A lot of people will say, oh, if you want to reduce the side effects of Tren, Run a lot of testosterone with it. Run an equal amount of testosterone or run more testosterone. Doesn't make any sense. Again, we're doing these podcasts. These are revisited 2024 updated podcasts to get you better acquainted to these steroids and make you smarter when it comes to using
Yes.
steroids. We're not doing this to spread bro science and shit that we've heard on the forum.
No.
We've used these compounds. We know what works. I've seen the blood work. I can confirm that run the test low with the trend. That will reduce the side effects, not increase them. All right. Another good stack, orals. You can use Anavar. You can use T-Bol. You can use Dianabol if you want mass and size. Great stack. And then Masteron, if you want to do a nice recomp, you could do some tests with Masteron, maybe 300 or 400 milligrams of either one. And then run a little, you might need a little AI in there. You might not, just depends. But that's a little recomp if you want some hardening effects. So really lots of different options. Mobster, I'll let you finish up your final thoughts before the disclaimer.
Right. So some of the information that was given in the past, Steve, I think came from the issues of availability. And what do I mean by that? Occasionally, not as often as it used to be, and I say that from looking back over the forums and all the forums I've been on for the last 30 years, it came from availability or choices, right? So we didn't have the choice that we had now. You were literally 30 years ago still having conversations about what was available from your quote unquote local dealer. And I never liked that term for when it comes to steroids, but it used to be the guy with the bag of steroids in the trunk of his car. And what do I mean? I still see this occasionally, Steve. Literally, this is what I've got, so this is what you should take. That's a little bit like going to a Coke dealer and asking for weed. Well, I haven't got any weeds, but I can sell you some Coke. You should have Coke instead. That's not what you're doing, right? In the modern age, we have greater accessibility in spite of obviously law enforcement than we've ever had before. Greater availability, greater range, multiple brands through different resellers and so on and so forth. So the excuse used to be you could only have this or this, and that's the reason why those things got recommended, because there wasn't any other choice. It's like going to a supermarket, Stephen. It's one kind of cornflakes. You've got multiple brands, multiple sellers. Come onto our forums, check out the sources, check out the approved sources, check out the companies that resell. You have availability of everything. That's all kinds of testosterone included. So you don't have to have that information anymore. Keep up to date. Make sure that you're getting what you need when you need. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions. Ours is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.